All right, back in Portland and recording PPM51. Slightly exhausted, just got back from Bates College where I was at with my daughter Sophia at Admitted Students Day, and good. It was very stimulating. Bates is I think it's going to be a really good place for her to study, for sure. And also, it's a somber day. This is the anniversary of the assassination of MLK. And being that our conference is going to be in Memphis next year, I'm very aware of that site as the place where that event occurred. So, in yesterday's meditation, at this point in the book, so for those of you just checking this out, this is a 10-year commemoration of a writing that I did, a daily piece of writing that I call Poetic Phenomenological Meditations. Go back to the beginning to get sort of, if you're interested in this, go back and watch some of the first meditations and or some preliminary ones where I talk about what it all is about. That happened 10 years ago, 2004, and the writing ultimately culminated in the book, Being and Learning, which is the title of the blog. This is Being and Learning, the book. There it is, Being and Learning. And so we're in chapter 4, and it's Plato's Allegory of the Cave. It's what we're doing, is the close reading of Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And so I've sort of presented what I call the 4 parts of the allegory, which is the setting of the scene, the liberation of the cave, one cave dweller, and their ascent out of, which includes their ascent out of the cave. Part 3 is their disclosure of the way things, the truth, their encounter with being, symbolized in the sun, the shining of the sun, and then their return back into the cave. And so yesterday was the first meditation that sort of began the reading, post-presentation reading. So after presenting all 4 parts, I'm now into sort of doing a post presentation and present analysis or phenomenology. Sort of, what I talked about yesterday was the sense in which the allegory sort of can leave one feeling as if it could be rewritten or was not completed. And in particular, I said that there was this sense in which Plato doesn't account for the liberated prisoner's capacity to speak and hear. So there's such an emphasis on the visual, but it's an odd thing for that emphasis to be there, because in fact, when the prisoner is still a member of the demos of the cave dwellers, as I've been calling it, what draws them together and what makes them into a sort of congregation or a community is their sharing of what they see, the shadows, and how what the shadows represent to them. He's very clear about this, and the way they do this is by speaking. And so speaking and listening are integral to the story, but that gets lost. That capacity, those forms of perception are lost along the way in some way, but they're not lost in the sense that he becomes unable to speak and hear. They just are lost because there's very little speaking that goes on in the allegory by the liberated one. The liberator says very little. I call him the silent liberator, although it is said to say something, but very little. At any rate, yesterday's meditation took up part of what I call the incompletion and the need to rewrite the allegory. So, and what I said was, in fact, at the end, were one to extend the allegory, one could and should perhaps pick up on this speaking and hearing, on the liberated prisoner's capacity to speak, and in particular, and to speak about the experience that they've had moving out of the cave and back in. And so I said his capacity to speak would enable him to tell his tale. But if this transformation is complete, then what he says will be said in an evocative manner. So, of course, evocative speech, if you go back and check out some of the earlier videos, is a very important component of being and learning. The sage, the figure of the teacher, is the one who delivers the tidings, what drawing on Heidegger I call the tidings of the word, right? Of the evocative word, of the words that, the principal words that initiate learning in an ontological sense. What I call those evocative sayings, or evocative speech, or evocative questioning, likewise provocative questioning. So to say that what he will say, the tale that the prisoner who has now been liberated would say would be evocative, stands within that framework of the sage and the one who teaches, speaking in an evocative way. So let's pick it up. So what might he say to them? To approach this question requires that we reflect on what motivated him to return to the cave. As we have already said, his return was his first real act as a truly liberated person. And this is significant. He was in no way in need of assistance when he made his way back down the long passage. His decision was his own, his final turning made because of his commitment to bring the news of this revelation back to his companions. Thus, it is crucial to recognize that the outcome of the transformation is the emergence of the teacher, of the sage, who returns to call his companions to join him in the exploration of this world that exists outside of the cave. In Plato's reflection on the allegory, he makes clear what Heidegger will underline later in his reading of the story, namely that the tale is an account of the essence of education. But what is the point of this education for Plato, and who is the sage? For Plato, this is a story of the production of the philosopher king, the guardian, who is able to take his place in the class of leaders because his vision is one of the good, of the harmony that persists between all things, enables him to properly discern the ways humans ought to live together. For Plato, the liberated one returns to rule over his companions, but this rule could only be accomplished if he were able to compel them to take the arduous journey he has undertaken, as it is inconceivable to imagine his ruling within this sphere that he no longer recognizes as a theater of oppression and illusion. One could not properly and authentically live in such a domain. So the liberated one is faced with the charge of compelling his companions to join him. That is, he must now liberate them. But it is precisely by carrying out this charge of liberation that the one who has been released can hardly be identified as a ruler in the sense of having power over his companions. Indeed, if this tale is meant to be a parable of Socrates, and thus yet another legend, then we must recognize that it is not the person who is meant to rule, but a way of life, an ontology that will rule or establish the foundation for their being. This existential rule will be called education, paideia, or the turning around that we have named attunement. The charge of the liberated one upon his return to the cave is to compel his friends to join him, though in the way that Socrates attempted to cultivate friendship through dialogue. The charge is one of cultivating love, and thereby overcoming the competitive or agonal way of interacting that has defined the engagement with one another previously. Thus, whatever he might say to his friends would have to be offered in the manner of the sage, who is intent on drawing them out of this habitat, the cave. And the only form of address that would compel them to undertake the disorienting ascent would be one that is rooted in the unmitigated commitment to his friends as equals. And this undercuts the sentiments in Plato that the allegory is a tale of the production of one who rules over others. But it is Plato himself that offers us the resources to reread this reflection on the story, for within the same reflection he underlines the spirit of equality that pervades the allegory, the spirit that motivates the liberated one to recall his companions and to return to them in order to recollect them for a journey of mutual exploration. Thus, Plato has his central character Socrates say about the allegory, "We must conclude that education is not what is said by some who profess to put knowledge into a soul that does not possess it, as if they could put sight into blind eyes. On the contrary, our own account signifies that the soul of every man does possess the power of learning the truth, and that the organ to see it with, and that just as one might have to turn the whole body around in order that the eye should see light instead of darkness, so the entire soul must be turned away from this changing world until its eyes can bear to contemplate reality and the supreme splendor which we have called the good. Hence, there may well be an art whose aim would be to effect this very thing, the conversion of the soul, in the readiest way, not to put the power of sight into the soul's eye, which already has it, but to ensure that instead of looking in the wrong direction, it is turned the way it ought to be." And that's from the Republic, 518. And that's where I concluded. So again, a big circle, because that passage that I just read from the Republic, passage 518, is really where the whole thing, the experiment, which originally started as an experiment of writing each day for a year, this passage is what motivated and prompted it. I'm responding to this passage right here. And so it's really sort of worth understanding and taking a longer look at it, because this is the definition that Plato, and perhaps he's drawing this from Socrates, and perhaps Socrates is drawing it from others. This is the definition of education. We all have the capacity within us. That's not the question. The question is how we can turn that capacity around to a perception of what it ought to be perceiving. In other words, what is it that capacitates us, not incapacitates us, because that means to make us impotent or to lose the power, but empowers us. What should we be perceiving? What is it that in the perception of it is a sort of what initiates learning, but also kind of fulfills it at the same time? There may well be an art whose aim would be to effect this very thing, the conversion of the soul, in the readiest way. Not to put the sight into the soul's eye, which it already has, but to ensure that instead of looking in the wrong direction, it is turned to what it ought to be. Now, that's a translation, of course. It is turned the way it ought to be. But for me, that captures so much of what this work is about. Because it is not so much the turning toward what it ought to be contemplating, but rather it is turned the way it ought to be. That is to say, it's turned around in a certain way. It has a manner, a repose, a composure, and that's the key. And so what the experiment is, and what the meditations are about, are in fact a phenomenology of this turn, right? So my thesis is, in fact, that one way to account for this is to suppose, it's a thesis, hypothesis, that when one is doing this daily kind of phenomenological writing in a poetic manner, that this may be an example of what it means to be turned in the quote-unquote a way one ought to be turned, in the sense in which one is undertaking education or thinking, actually, in contemplation in the way that Plato is describing it. So that's really what the whole work, the whole project comes down to Plato's Republic 518. That should possibly have been the subtitle of the book. So I'm going to leave it at that, because my daughter has just come around to signal that it's time for her to go off to her cafe to work. And yeah, so that's from today, 10 years ago, this date, April the 4th, 2004, originally written and read and commented on this day, April 4th, 2014, the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., leader of the civil rights movement, one of the most important members of these United States to ever live.